Welcome everyone. This is Gloucester Cultural Initiative with our community partner, Manship Artist Residency. And we're really thrilled to be able to bring you this webinar with Charles Landry, renowned author and urbanist. And I've been following him for quite a few years. Mary Jenkins, that you probably know pretty well in Massachusetts anyway, was the initiator of the creative economy and cultural districts. She's worked here quite extensively in Gloucester, and she has moved back to the UK. And we're happy to have her back here because she was such an influence on the community here. She was with the Plan 2000 and helped there. And she's helped lots of artists and cultural community here and worked with the cities and municipalities throughout Massachusetts in dealing with many issues. And I would like to thank also our board of directors, who is from GCI, who is sponsoring this event, Martin Ray, Kevin Fahey, who is doing the webinar, and also Robert Haverkamp, Judith Hoglander, and Valerie Nelson, who is the program manager, who has brought these roundtables and this program to you today. So I just want to start. Thank you all for coming. We've got a great list of people popping in, and this is recorded. And we welcome you at the end of the event there'll be a question and answer. And we'd like to give as much time as possible to Charles to give his wisdom from all over the world that affect us all here in Gloucester as well. So welcome. Thank you all for coming. And I turn this over to Mary Jenkins.
Hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be invited to be in this particular room to have a conversation with Charles Landry, who I have enormous respect for. He is both, he is one of the most thoughtful practitioners and leaders on issues of city making that I've ever come across. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking myself. I'm going to just say hello, Charles, and how are you today?
Hi, everybody. I'm broadly fine. My voice is croaking, so I'm hoping it will survive, and I'm sure it will.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. And so I think the way this is going to work is that people won't be able to talk to us during the course of this part of the presentation. But if you have something pops up, or you think of something, or you want to ask Charles a question, then please feel free to put it in chat, and then we'll have time for questions towards the end of the session, which I will be I will be sort of offering Charles. So I guess, to make a beginning, I think we have to go back several years to sort of where you first started.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was going to do a presentation which goes a bit through that loop and the conclusions that I reached, and I was going to do a visual story of that, if that seems fine.
Sure.
Well, look, it was really interesting. I got this message via LinkedIn, I think, and it was from Gloucester. And I thought, hey, what a relief. That's just 20 minutes away from me. Great, let's talk. And then I suddenly see it's Gloucester, Massachusetts. And I thought, oh my God, I'm only going to be able to see you virtually. So I'm really sorry about that. Anyway, that's life. And I just thought, because I had a couple of conversations with Joanne, Valerie, and so on, and Mary about this presentation, and thought I might just go through, in a sense, the history of how I got to where my thinking is now. And one of the things that happened was I was asked to do an exhibition, as you can see, called The Art of Creative City Making in Sicily. And this old little truck thing drove around the town saying, hey, Charles Landry's here. And everybody sort of looked into the sky and said, who the hell's he? What does he want? But anyway, what it was very good for me was to work out what I think. And so what I think is that practically every city, large and small, is thinking about where they're going, you know, how do you link in nature into the physical, all of these sort of things. And they're thinking about, most cities are thinking about the future in one way or another. We're living in a nomadic world, there are dramatic transformations happening and so on. And what I reminded myself was a quote by a biologist from a long time ago, Patrick Geddes, 130 years ago, who said, "A city is more than a place in space, it's a drama in time." And actually, whether we like it or not, in every city, it's basically a drama of some sort, hopefully a good drama. And what I do feel, and what I've sensed, that there's a real yearning in cities, even though people have different opinions, to have something that sort of aligns with their values, who they are, where somehow the common good is ideally reflected in one way or another. And in this exhibition, all through the town, there were these posters which said things like, "Is there an ideal city?" This was asking the citizens of this town called Favara. And the answer, obviously, is there's no ideal city, but some cities are better than others. Then another thing we were very concerned about is your city listening, asking the citizens this question. And they filled all sorts of marks on all these posters throughout the town. Other questions asked were, can you change a city? Well, the answer, of course, people said, well, only if you give me the opportunity to be part of the decision making, then I can change the city. And then also I could be a city maker if you give me a chance to be a maker, shaper, co-creator. And then they were asked, is your city inspiring? Now, mostly people said, yes, no, but I don't know what Gloucester people think. And as you can see here, this is all on the walls of the city. Is your city going up? Now, all that's leading up to was a series of rooms where I was really trying to define what I'm about to talk about. What is great city making? How does that work? Now, cities, so much of cities is invisible. What the hell is a city? A city is a series of things. The cliche is, obviously, it's people. Obviously, it's activities. Clearly, it's hardware, and so often people think cities are just hardware, but it's also software, and I'm looking at this in a more techie way. But activities are also, in a way, the software, the things people do, what they do for their business, for their leisure activities, and so on. But a city is also, to use computer language, an orgware. It has an organizational culture. So the question is, what sort of culture has Gloucester got? Is it inward looking? Is it outward looking? It's also a network of communities within that place. The key question always is, are they connecting? Or is it just disparate islands operating in their own bubbles? And then the next question is there collaboration between these bubbles to create the mosaic that is the city? Now, of course, what's happened, there's been this massive breakthrough, which has completely thrown us off course, which is really the digitizing world that has accelerated everything, which has really caused people to feel uncertain, they feel a loss of control, and so on. So, in a sense, we could say that is a version of what a city is. Now, the origins, because I'm associated with the notion of the creative city and trajectory, I just wanted to say a few words about that. Now, the creative city, what was it initially? What was the inspiration? The inspiration was massive decline in many, many places in Europe as industry went to the East, China, and so on. You know all that. You had a version of that in the US. Now, the question, what I then came to conclude after a while, what's the thing that's really driving success or failure in city? And I concluded, and this is the sort of conversation I had with Mary many years ago, it's actually culture. But people also normally think, oh, culture is just an afterthought. It's the frilly decoration on top. But I think the way we discussed culture was as a deeper level, that it's the way you think, your behavior, where you think you've come from, where you are and where you are going. And so it's really like the other invisible hand that makes a place function, how it connects with its inhabitants, etc., etc. So it's not only the invisible hand of the market, there's the invisible hand of culture. And of course, that's, as I said a minute ago, not necessarily our operating system. Another thing I concluded, and I'm summarizing sort of a number of years of thinking about it, and you know this sentence, culture is who we are, and creativity is what we can become. And so really this whole notion of the creative city idea is saying most people have some sort of intellectual or other talents, resources, and so on that can be harnessed towards the future of the city. Now, the conception of this is just building three things together: culture, creativity, and the city, and how you can use those two things, culture seen broadly, sometimes also narrowly, in the way the city transforms, whether for good or for bad. So now clearly at the time it started thinking about, I'm thinking of my first work in the late 80s in Glasgow. We looked at a declining city and said, well, what have you got? You've got a deep culture, you've got great arts. Is that going to help? It obviously has employment effects. It has indirect and direct benefits. It has symbolic effects like on tourism, image, and so on. So that was the initial focus of this notion of the creative city. And what people did, and Mary did lots of work like this and saw that this whole area is going up. And when you add all the little elements together, dance, choirs, music, it's a big, big sector. So it was seen very much as an economic sector, as indeed it is in Gloucester. So that's that. But what it also did, this notion of using the arts at the time, and we're not only going to talk about the arts today, is it really triggered an urban revitalization dynamic across the world. Thousands of buildings were revitalized, adapted for reuse. Lots of places sort of changed. And then there were some unintended consequences. One of them, which you know in Gloucester probably, is that suddenly you have an old building like this in Berlin, happens to be one, and suddenly people say, oh, right, what can I do with that? Okay, it's all a bit weird, that building. Let's get some champagne out and completely transform it into something completely different. The other unintended consequence of this is in Zurich, West Zurich, where then they're revitalizing the city. There's the Renaissance Hotel there. And then one artist said, I'm not going to let my house just fall down. I'm going to put resistance in exactly the same typeface. And that exemplifies for me one of the key problems of city development. As cities develop, there's a lot of pushing out of people if the city is attractive, like Gloucester is. Clearly, you've got issues of affordability and so on. And unless there is planning ahead about issues of affordability and these problems, well, they are problems, and rising prices, the city itself, you would have to say, is it successful? There's a big question mark. So then, when thinking about the creative city, I thought, there's a much bigger story there. What can you do in a place where there's a culture of openness, a culture of seeing things afresh? Let's call it a culture of creativity, a culture where people say, oh, you've got an idea, let me listen to this idea. Let's see what other imaginations we've got. Is there social innovation there? Is there good business innovation, scientific? And one of my recent obsessions is their bureaucratic innovation and creativity. So that's really now the bigger template that folds into it all these other things about art and these bigger stories at the same time about economics and so on. And if you argued about what is this all about, you'd say it probably is a shift in paradigm. But what at its heart is an empowering ethos, which is saying, look, ordinary people, if given the chance, can make the extraordinary happen. But you've got to listen to them. As I said at the very beginning, you've got to see whether it works or not. Obviously, these processes can sometimes be wearying, and it's much nicer to go the Chinese way and say, okay, we're just doing this, forget everybody. But I think that holes, later problems. So then what we decided to do over time is refocus what creativity could be. So it addressed the big issues that really matter. And I don't need to spell them all out. We're living the big issues that really matter. But to solve problems with some sort of verve and interesting perspectives. Now, one thing I think is clear, and I presume it feels like this in the US as well, but here it feels like in Europe, that we are in the midst of a systemic crisis where a business as usual approach is not going to work. You have to, for example, combine public and private interests and voluntary interests together. Because we know that the way our economic order and way of life works is materially expansive, it's socially divisive, division is getting up higher and higher, and inequality, and environmentally hostile. I mean, which has really been a wake-up call for everybody. I saw this graffiti in Athens last week. So the great transition that we're facing, that is all of these issues, is itself a cultural project seen in the biggest sense, because it's about values. What are our values? What is the mindset? What are the habits? What are the attitudes? What are the skills we're bringing to this transition and transformation we want to achieve, namely, hopefully, create a good city? Now, we know that the earth hurts in some way. It's showing it all the time. The amount of rain we've had this last month has been more than ever, just as a random example. And here is an artist, Oliver Eliasson, who you'd probably know, Icelandic, who brought bits of the icebergs from Greenland to Paris and elsewhere. And when people just saw them melt, they understood that there's an issue here. So what we know is our footprint, our carbon footprint. This is another artistic project, funnily enough, from a long time ago in Eastern Europe, which is just saying it's too big. And that fossil fuels, we could have a hydrogen economy, but we don't. So this artist, in a sense, is spelling a message out. This was in Basel, just in the streets, and it tells you a message of what we might need to do. This is another example. I'm just using artistic examples, and I won't stick to those. But here, when I was born, there were 2.1 billion people in the world. Now there are 8 billion. Well, of course, you're using more and more land. Of course, you're digging up the soil. Of course, problems are happening. Of course, there'll be more pandemics because this is happening. More and more people are squeezed into less and less land. Here's another example. The World Expo in Dubai had an immersive environment, which is in New Zealand. This is the New Zealand Pavilion. They have given the river a legal status. And in the Expo 2020, you immersively walked through and experienced being inside the river, what it feels like for a river suffering. Very, very clever. So anyway, all these sort of things are coming together. And even ordinary events about cities, like here, Amsterdam, a big annual event called We Make the City, what are the new ideas? You can see that itself, it's sort of quite playful, the way it talks to people, what it does. Yes, we all know we need to be smarter, we need to be more inclusive, but it does so in a way that has a sort of relaxed tone that allows you perhaps to communicate across difference. Anyway, we all know 2 days ago was the Global Solutions Summit in Berlin, that many of these things are global, but at the same time, we need to locally address them. So therefore, what is the essence of being a city? The essence of being a city is really living together with strangers as strangers. Obviously, we know some people. I know we try to then get into our own bubbles and stuff like that. But there's a city as a whole, most people we don't know. Now, the question, are we going to stay in the bubble? Are we going to talk across difference? Are we going to trust each other? I set up just before the pandemic a Biennale of Trust in Lviv in the Ukraine. We only had one version because then the problems started. But this was very interesting. We did things like meet in the KGB headquarters and got different people from the media and different population groups to talk to each other about the future of live. So there we are. So it's about obviously finding formats where people can communicate and try and share agendas. These are the big issues that I'm seeing from my side when I'm working with cities. And there's two big words. There's conviviality, that word, living together, convivere, living together. But the Portuguese version, I think, is better, because conviviality sounds like it's all very cozy. We're all sitting here. You're having your coffee, tea, or whatever. Mary and I will shortly perhaps have a glass of wine. I don't know. But the Portuguese word is convivência. And that's very different. Convivência is saying, yes, we're together, but it's like a family. And when we're in a family, sometimes we're really arguing. It's a pain in the neck, but we've got to get on with each other. We've got to get on with the aunt and the uncle, and me, the old granddad, has got to play with the young grandchildren and stuff like that. So a city is more like convivencia. It's a place, I don't want to say complete tension, but there is always tension. And that's the wonderful task of city making. Tension could be between religions. I've just put 3 religious icons there. But essentially, it's talking across difference. And once we see that, we can see the fragility of things and how important it is to talk together, to communicate. And I suppose I was saying that the autistic world is often quite good at bringing together people to talk to each other. So then the question to me is, what the hell triggers change and creates a transformative effect? And I'm not trying to be negative, by the way. It's just that when I'm taking an overview of cities, this is what I'm seeing all the time. So what is, well, what happens? You try and create a transformative effect and you hit a brick wall. Why do you hit a brick wall? You know why we hit a brick wall. Because what are the obstacles? There's someone who's got a vested interest and pretends they're just being objective, but they've got a vested interest. There's someone who hasn't changed their views for a while. There's just bad ideas sometimes. Sometimes there are very bad ideas. And in city making, there's very many bad ideas. Clearly, from a climate perspective, spreading suburbia too far and not having connection and public transport, deciding not to do that is a bad idea, just as an example. Another obstacle is anxiety. And I think that comes from the speed of change happening, that people are just worried and feel loss of control, which leads in one way to polarization. Another obstacle is there's no alignment of view. There's no shared information. People are just going to different channels. They're all in echo chambers. We don't know. You don't believe what the other person says. You deny that that's a truth. There's no talking together enough at a city level. We do talk together in bubbles, in restaurants and so on. And then therefore there's no joint story. Well, if there's no joint story of your city, where the hell is the city going? Which is why I believe we need to see the city as a project. And another thing that I think is quite interesting, lots of cities had great things about them. So, for example, this is less the case in Gloucester, but there was often mixed use. You know, there was a shop in the bottom, then an office on the first floor, living on the second and third. That really created self-sustaining high streets and neighborhoods and so on. And we forget that those things exist and we could recreate them. The other thing, of course, is the blast of new media that is, overwhelming us. But as I said earlier, this endless forgetting is actually quite a big point, forgetting those things that worked well. So now that we've hit the brick wall, now what? There has to be a plan B, because it can't go on like that. And more places are saying it can't go on. We can't live with this tension. And they're saying things like, the dialogue of difference is key. Now, I chaired and meeting for 2 days in Athens with 300 people from around the world, and I had to be a keynote listener. And I just had to listen for 2 days. And listening so sharply made me lose my voice, believe it or not. Anyway, what happened is the key message from these people from Nigeria, from the US, many from the US, South America, Australia, everywhere, was we've got to have a dialogue of the differences. We've got to hear the other voice. The other voice is we've got to learn to listen. And there are many examples. I've been here. Next time it happens, you should go. It's called the Biennale Democrazia. I had the Biennale of Trust. This is the Democracy Biennale. This was happening in the streets. There were events. So people were coming out and seeing each other. It wasn't all hidden in the background. So what I'm just really saying is there are so many ways to address this in ways that are quite engaging and engaging the population. So again, I think everybody's asking, what makes a livable city, given the pressures of the dynamics of economics and so on that I mentioned earlier? What can we do? And this is where we come back to the civic. How can we come back to that dialogue? And what is the civic? The civic is the agreements that are created through focusing perhaps more than what we want or share than what divides us. And so this brings us to this point about beyond the self, that of course, different countries are different. Europe is a bit more, some of you would probably say it's completely socialist, which is completely untrue. But what we basically think should be a good balance between the public and the private sector. It may be different in the States, I don't know. So what drives then that change, having hit that brick wall and trying to move forward? I think clearly it's how we think, our ethics. Do we believe in the goodness of people, etc.? Having an ambition or ideas, then having a mission, and so on. And of course, leadership, and we'll come back to that in a second, but particularly some sort of sketch or story. And I know that's easy to say, and I say sketch rather than a story, because a story is a bit like saying, oh, we need a brand, Gloucester is. No, it's some sort of collective agreement about who we are, where we're going, but perhaps a sketch first, because we don't know the detail. So leadership for a second. I think leadership, in the examples I've seen, is the leaders are those, and leadership is not one mayor, in my view, it's many people in a city who summon the angels in us and knock the darker sides. Very easy to say, but difficult to do. And I know that increasingly people are not summoning our angels, they're summoning and focusing on what divides us. And that's where it's all about, obviously, finding common ground. And this is a street in Genoa where they just said we need a different story of our city. So it reminds me that whatever Gloucester does, it's about the next generation. It's not about us. The people in this room are probably all, I don't know how old we are collectively, but too old. It's, will you open doors? I just happened to be in a lift and I saw this lift and suddenly the doors opened and I thought, yes, all that we're talking about, the younger people are not the future, they're current, they're now. Now, will they be able to afford somewhere to live? In London, a younger person cannot buy somewhere for themselves unless they've got rich parents. So when you just wander around, I just took this in Athens, it's not surprising that people say wasted youth and that graffiti there. So my conclusion in that, sorry, I'm always showing you this brick wall, but we're trying to break the brick wall, is the market on its own cannot solve the wicked problems. The wicked problems, which are very complex, it could be unemployment, drugs, and everything together, and being homeless, can only be dealt with collaboratively. And some people have got to give something up. People who are better off have to give something up. Cities require compromises between the differences. And it has to be, I think this story, this sketch has to be framed within a narrative of opportunity. Now, question, can arts and artists help? Can culture help? Some people say no. Others say yes. Well, perhaps they can. So what can they do? We've given some examples before, but I think the value added is there's certain sort of thinking that we legitimize in people that come in creative fields, whether they're a designer, whether they're, I don't know what, they could be a performer of some sort, but is to embed or legitimize that thinking in other disciplines, like urban planning, like economic development, that people think a bit more laterally, sort of what if, allowing the what if to happen. So to foster that imagination and say, it's all right to have imagination. We don't need to know all the answers immediately. So the big question then, therefore, to me, is what is the strategy of influence? And I think a key word for me is orchestration, because I've given sort of lots of elements and pinpoints here and there, but it's a question of how do you bring them together? And bringing them together requires the different stakeholders to have mutual respect for what each gives to the story that needs to unfold. So that means being paced and purposeful, strategically principled, i.e., what are the key things we want? Let's say we want justice, or we want some sense of equality. We want people to be prosperous, words like that. We want people to feel good, etc. But how we get there, we don't know. But we know those are the principles, but we have to be tactically flexible. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be quite difficult sometimes for the public authority, because that implies then having something I call elastic planning. You've got to be a bit moving and willing to move. And you need an incentives and regulations regime that allows that to happen. So the guiding principle for me, if you're being simplistic, and I'm not in Gloucester, is how can you move from a no because culture, everybody's saying no because, to one that says yes. Okay, I see, I broadly disagree with you, but yes, if. And that's simple to say, but is actually, I think, quite a powerful point. Now, within that comes this notion of the creative bureaucracy, which we've run now for 7 years, and it's happening next week in Berlin. And already 1,600 people have registered. So there's obviously some fever for people from across the world want to see the interesting examples of new ways of bureaucrats and their allies. They're allies. The private sector is an ally. It's not an enemy. And the NGO sector is an ally, as is the university. And asking, what can we do? Now, we know the cliche, it's all red tape, sometimes true, sometimes wrong. This shows great confidence. This is in front of the municipal buildings in Reykjavik in Iceland. For them to put that sculpture there shows that, they're willing to take the mickey out of themselves. So the central message is that if given the chance, administrators have imagination as well. They operate within rules. But good bureaucracy is a competitive tool. We know that from less developed countries. Unless there's a good public administration, the whole thing is absolute chaos. So another guiding principle is, of course, the public administrations are everything, but without taking them into account and working with them, nothing much can work. So what I think is necessary is to recapture those positive values that are part historically of what a bureaucracy was. And what one's trying to do there is get the collective imagination of a town or a city like Gloucester and say, look, collectively, somehow we in this city have the answers. Now, there are many examples of this. There are new roles, there are new departments, there are new institutions, there are new programs, there are new processes. And I'll give you some examples. There are far too many. Here's an example. The Future Generations Commissioner post in Wales, the first country in the world to do that, seeing every planning proposal through the eyes of the next generation. The Civic Imagination Office in Bologna, in Italy, and Cluj in Romania, just as two examples, where they gather the citizenry to imagine what could be. Or the Think City Penang project, where they said, we want to have economic development, but we want social development as well. Simultaneously, we don't want economic development to push back the distinctiveness of the place and so on. Penang in Malaysia, the super block in Barcelona, legislative theatre. So what I mean here, this lady here, Sophie Howe, who we've just given an award to, is the just finished Future Commissioner for Wales. She shifted the whole way the transport system went and shifted the budget in Wales away from only building roads to also thinking of other forms of transport. Or here, a new role, the Chief Exploration Officer for the Ministry of Interior in the Netherlands. Her role is simply to find any good examples anywhere and to bring them into her institution and to promote it. This is a meeting of the Civic Imagination Office in Bologna. Or here is what Penang has become. This is an interesting street which is completely decrepit. Now their problem is much more having far too many tourists and so on. But they maintained the distinctiveness of the place. The super block Barcelona, Barcelona is filled with cars racing. It's incredibly hectic and so on. But they changed the way all of these roads looked. Cars can still go through, but the cars have become a guest. So it looks like that. Children have suddenly come out into the streets. People are walking, people are playing games, but cars are still happening there, but much, much slower. And legislative theatre is that when you've got a problem, you play a theatre play, and you who are affected by it, let's say it's a homeless thing, the homeless people play the role of a homeless person. Manchester did it in England, not your Manchester, and the person who was the homeless, one of them or two of them, became employees of the local authority to help address the homeless problem. So here is another example. Gendered landscaping. This is Umeå in Sweden, near the Arctic, which is the most women-friendly city probably in the Nordic countries, which has shifted how bus stations work so they feel much safer, how any underpass works and so on, by having a project for many, many, many years called the Gendered Landscape. So looking at everything through the eyes of women and how they feel, which of course is great for men as well. So what all of this shows is quite simple. Whether we like it or not, we've got to go through that difficult process of trying to just think, plan, act with imagination together rather than on our own. And so on and so on. There are more examples. There's the Ministry of Possibilities in the UAE. There's public practice and newer recruitment agents in the UK, which is overwhelmed by people from the private sector wanting to get into the public sector. And they're teaching them how the public sector works. Surprising. They have hundreds and hundreds of applicants every day. Or Placemaking Europe, which really has shaped how we think of public space. And also, finally, Helsingborg had a brilliant thing. When a bureaucrat made a mistake, a failure, they gave them an award and gave them money to go on a training course. So you can see there are many examples of changing rules, rethinking things. And what we're really saying is we've got to have a vision, but the vision has to shape the rules, not the rules, the vision, and therefore restrict us. So there we are. This is probably what an enabling culture is. And it's a place that really ask the questions. Are we doing it the right way? According to the law, are we doing the right thing? Are we doing the letter of the law or the spirit of the law? And that's what it means moving towards a more creative bureaucracy that connects with the private sectors and the other sectors at the same time. So I believe it's a movement in the making. I don't know what you think. So that transformation, as I said earlier, is a bit like a cultural project because it's about behavior, habits, values, mindsets, and so on. Of course, easy to say, difficult to do, and it requires courage. Thank you very much.
Charles, thank you. We have about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes to kind of get at questions. And I'm going to kick off by asking you a really basic question about bureaucracies, which is that people in cities experience change in politicians on a, regular basis. So as that change happens, so does the agenda. And it's like it's like a continual research every time it happens. How do you suggest that Gloucester is embarked on a 10-year plan, which actually arches over the sort of politics of the, and the way that people vote for the sort of local politicians. How do you sustain then the long-term sort of conversation that's necessitated when a bureaucracy is shifting and the people within it are shifting?
And it's a key question. I mean, that's why I kept on saying that if there can be agreement, that's why it's so important to have getting beyond the politicians and having that stakeholdership of this wider grouping. And as long as we can get a wider grouping, nothing against politicians, by the way, but if we can get an agreement beyond the individual politicians who are in the moment, then we begin to sort of move forward because we can then have what I call that strategic principles, whatever the key things we want to achieve, whatever those headings are. And they're all pretty obvious headings normally that they are, we want better public space, we want some affordable housing, we want whatever, all of that. As long as one's got those strategic principles in place and it's agreed by a bigger grouping than just the particular political party, you've got more chance of that happening.
Mm-hmm. And then the second part of that question is that some of the problems that cities experience are problems that have been around, they're circular, they keep coming back. So the boomerang effect of problems like homelessness, housing affordability, food security, business starts, and so on and so forth. So how do you address that repetition?
Well, I mean, it depends
when you're trying to make a new beginning.
Yeah, I mean, some of those problems get worse and some of them do disappear. I mean, I am a great admirer of Roseanne Haggerty, a US lady from New York who runs that homelessness project Community Solutions, which is amazing. So there's always examples of particularly in America, there's so many good examples somewhere of people addressing some of the more specific problems you've got. Obviously, the fentanyl problem and all of that. It's easy just to use the words and pretend you know an answer. But some of the problems really, I think one of the ways is giving people a voice, because we're not going to solve all the problems everywhere and every time. But if people feel a bit more empowered and less of a victim, then they might be part of creating their own solution. If the issue is, for example, poverty in a place, that's obviously different than some of the things I've heard about in Gloucester, that some sectors are obviously declining. On the other hand, it's so attractive that incomers are coming in. This is where it's a really difficult thing to think through, because if what's happening to Gloucester is that more people are coming in, then one's really got to think 10 years ahead and say, well, what is the implication of that? Prices are going to rise a lot. Can we do something now in advance to circumvent that? And what I said there early, bending the market to bigger picture purposes, which again is about collaboration. I'm not against the market. Of course, I'm not against the market. I've been running my own business for 45 years. It's how it is framed within bigger objectives, because the market, what it mostly wants is certainty. And what I found really interesting talking to banks and stuff like that, which is my recent obsession, is how you can be imaginative in financial senses. And I was in Poland a few weeks ago, and there were all these bankers saying, all we need is ROI, what's the rate of return and all that. And their development bank said, actually, we don't try and maximize profit, not at all. We, in fact, go a few percentage lower because we know that we can then develop projects that invest in education, invest in inequality and all of those things, which ultimately creates more prosperity for us. So it's actually, we need to bring into the agenda that all of us, for example, can talk about imaginative ways of dealing with money beyond just saying, I need a philanthropist to help me, because there are these mechanisms, social impact bonds, green bonds, all sorts of things that are out there. But we as a sort of community don't, because we are not normally haven't studied finance, economics or something, don't relax into that. But I think we all need to be part of that money debate and where the money goes to.
So you're saying, it sounds to me as though you're saying, get curious and find out what other people are doing in order to both learn, in order to see whether there's a broader solution or a solution you haven't thought of. The tendency is to get into a room and think you have to find the solution.
Absolutely. That's why I was saying that slide, and I might have gone too quickly, new roles, new departments, new institutions. The moment you start opening your eyes, you suddenly see it's all over the place. And I bet if one of you did some research in the US, you'd suddenly find, name a problem, and then what are the solutions that have happened within the context of the US and in the context of cities that are 150,000 of 150. I bet there will be solutions. And if they're not, then flip over to Latin America or Europe as an example to see if there are solutions there.
Okay, so there's a question here from one of the attendees. To what degree does cultural change or transformation release anxiety and fear? And what are people afraid of?
Well, it's a good question, Kevin. You know the answer to that, I think. I mean, cultural change and transformation is both anxious making and so on. But the thing that I think people are afraid of, I mean, we've had Brexit here, and that was a lot about the fear of the outsider and the fear of this and loss of control and, I can't cope with technology and all of that. So I think that there was a more settled world in the past, and that has been, that destabilization has created some of the problems, which is why I think it's important the cultural projects, in a sense, that acknowledge people's culture and where they come from. So if you want to change someone, in my opinion, you don't say, oh, it's about time you bloody change, you're completely useless. You say, what you've got, how can we go with the grain of what you've got and then perhaps transform it? I know, Kevin, this is not the most sophisticated answer in the world, but I can see another 7 questions there.
There's one other question that's come up, which is, structurally, cities are placed within regions and they're placed within, there's a kind of interrelationship, and there are agencies that operate at a regional level. Does the same kind of sort of shift apply to regional entities in relation to working with cities? What kind of approach could be adopted that would be appropriate?
Well, what's happened, I think that, is that this regional question, the language is multi-stakeholder governance or something, some word that is not normal enough, where how do all these levels work, and who, in a sense, has authority about which topic, and where would resources come from to encourage X, Y, and Z. That is a big issue that's currently being mulled over, and I don't think there's a one size fits all on that. I mean, in some cases, you really do want a regional perspective, just simply because there may, for example, be more resources. Also, so I can't answer that in a black and white way. All I can say is that's an issue that a lot of places are discussing and finding the solution that is right for them. But in my view, one should probably try and look at it from its regional perspective. Just to give you a silly example that was a classic cultural example. So cities in the core, let's say Toronto, provided theatres, everything, concert halls and stuff like that. Then the boundary outside was not Toronto, but all those people benefited from all of that infrastructure and didn't make any contribution to it. That's the classic problem where you say, okay, look, you're benefiting from all this. Why aren't you contributing? The same is with, let's say, public transport or even roads, so on. So these are difficult negotiations that the cities need to have. But the regional perspective is better for certain topics. But I think also for economic development, it's usually better because not everything is happening inside the city.
Okay. And then there's another question here. Oh, a quick question was, you mentioned the name of the women-friendly city in Sweden.
UMEA, the gendered landscape. Sorry, when I say the gendered landscape, that's just something you can look up and then you'll see lots of material. But Umeå, I mean, let me just put it like this. It's quite interesting. Umeå is the 10th biggest. I was there 2 weeks ago and I've had lots of relations with them for 15 years. I'm not trying to pretend I'm very holier than thou. It's just a coincidence. But for example, they're the 10th biggest city in Sweden, but they've been Swedish football champions 8 times, which sort of seems to me perhaps connected. That they liberated women, they can do what they like, sort of thing, and they play good football.
Okay, so there's another question here. You used a slide that said what triggers change.
Yeah.
And that change is inevitable, change is inevitable, progress is not. Should the question be what triggers progress? And by the way, and what is progress? And what is progress?
Good point. Perhaps I should adjust that. I mean, the reason I put what triggers change or the transformative effect, I was thinking change, sometimes negative change, which is why I talked about obstacles. And then I said, effectively, was trying to say, oh, what are opportunities? But whoever said that, I need to scroll down and agree with that person, whoever it is. Thank you very much for that. What next?
And then
oh, there's so many interesting questions here. My God,
really interesting questions. I think people are going to want to know more about where would they find information about some of the examples you've talked about today? Are these embedded in some of your writing?
Well, I mean, yeah, they are. I mean, we can have a chat later, Mary and Joanne and Valerie, what we might do. Yeah, we'll sort that somehow.
All right.
Who was that? That was someone.
And then there's something. So you talked about risk aversion is very, this person says is very much alive and well amongst local political leaders. I mean, so what good examples do you have where this aversion has been overcome? I mean, in terms of the bureaucracies you're talking about, where has a bureaucracy sort of shifted and turned themselves around in order to kind of affect that change, aside from some of the appointments that you were talking about, which are fantastic examples of being able to put someone in place? How do you?
Yeah, and apart from those examples,
Yeah.
which can be scaled up, they can be copied. You know, they're not rocket science. Some of them. The risk aversion point. Well, again, sorry that I'm focusing on Europe, but in Europe, many countries now have a public innovation entity, which is saying, I'll give you an example. Sweden, Innova, INNOVA. That's doing experiments all the time. It's giving money to local authorities to try and make decisions in that civic imagination office type of way, where people get out of offices, working together with different people. The Danish government has a public-private innovation, not ministry, but department, where they're trying to find different ways of innovating across those sectors. So a lot of those things are about risk aversion, as that failure reward I talked about. What's really happening, and this is, you know, it's all very well for me to talk about a special department. The key point is, how can you embed it in such a way, which is basically saying, look, I know we're going to try this. Sometimes it's going to fail, but I'm not going to sack you for failing, because so, which is where I come back to this thing that I feel is a bit like a movement in the making. The OECD, you know, most all of you will know what they are. They have a special department on public sector innovation. So that's global. And then you go down to the local. All of these entities are beginning to slowly align. Now, in this, one of the key players, as you well know, is Bloomberg Philanthropies, which has worked with so many cities in the States on the sort of questions and issues that I'm just talking about now. And that's around the corner from all of you.
So is that, you know, I mean, the other, so well, as we end, I've got one last question for you, which is, Gloucester involved in a really serious planning process at the moment, which is gathering a lot of information. And that will, you know, that will be a series of strategies that then have to be taken into action. How do you prioritize what happens first? What do you do?
That's a very good point. I mean, if I'm working with a city and sorry, I'm just saying my own perspective, and
Sure.
other people have other approaches. What I tend to do is have two sides: easy, cheap, short term, something you can do immediately, easy and cheap, moving towards difficult, long term, expensive. And I sort of draw up a graph of what one can do. And what the thing is you're trying to build momentum. And what you're trying to build momentum through early winners and stuff like that. So let's say in Gloucester, there's a bit of a disagreement about something. You might be able to agree about something that you formally disagree with, and then you have a little success, which helps to create a bigger success. So it's this sort of matrix that I often have in my mind or write down on a piece of paper, which is trying to then think about this word again. I used orchestration. So always thinking about the energy. Who can I get involved? So I know this sounds a bit vague, like talking about energy. Ooh, I'm talking about energy. But it is about people's energy, how you can draw them into your web and effectively seduce them through this. And this is where storytelling comes in, because you then sort of say, wouldn't it be good if? Do you agree if? And if one can get into that more storytelling mode rather than I believe this versus this and so on, you're beginning to open things out. So I would have a combination of easy things, achievable things that are a bit difficult, and then a couple of things that are part of the principle, like we really need to get there. That's how I would possibly do it if I was sitting in the room with you. But in Gloucester, it would be so difficult. People would say, you're from the UK, you don't know what's going on here.
Sure. Sure. We're out of time. So, Charles, I want to thank you so much for your energy, your long-term energy around this agenda and the discoveries you've made, and that, you know, in a way, how provocative you are.
All
In
right.
sort of thinking, you know, and prodding people to consider and think about how to effect change in a way that actually is beneficial to a broad swath of people.
Yeah, I'd love to see the faces of some of these people like Greg Federspiel. Federspiel, as you know, means feather game. Elena Sani. Who are these people? They're wonderful. They must be wonderful. They must be interesting in some way.
Sure,
Christ.
absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, okay, you don't need to show each of yourself. That's all fine. But anyway, I wish I was in Gloucester. My Gloucester is round the corner.
And
Okay.
hi, Mary. Thank you so much, Mary and Charles. That was fabulous. Possibly we can, you know, when everyone closes out, we can stay on for a moment and end our business for the day. But thank you so much for everyone coming. This has been absolutely wonderful, and for everyone who has joined us. We'll have more information coming out to everyone, and we'll respond with a recording and make sure that you all get that information. You can also write to us any other questions that you might have, but Landry has quite a few pieces of information online, and we'll try to get you some of that information as well. So just do a quick little search, Charles Landry, and there's a wealth of information.
I mean, all of my little books you can download for free. So just you'll find them there, and big books as well.
And
And that's your
download them like
Charles,
crazy.
Charles, that's your website? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not the best website, but just it says download. Just if you explore a bit, you'll immediately be able to download stuff.
And this is
Whatever.
Comedia. This is
Yeah,
Comedia.
no, it says charleslandry.com.
CharlesLandry.com. Okay,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Landry is Landry.
yeah, not laundry. Landry.
Laundry.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so that's brilliant. So that's charleslandry.com for those of you who are still on board and are about to exit. I think
So see you all. See you, Hoglander. I don't know who you are. Valerie Stay, Elena, Martin, Craig, etc., etc.